Apparently. All right, so thank you very much, everybody, for tuning in. My name is Troy McCann, and I'm the founder of Moonshot, an international engine for space startups. And so today, we've got a very special Q&A session with some really amazing people who are the architects behind the new Australian Space Agency that you may have heard of. So these people are just a few, almost half of the group that were tasked with advising the Australian federal government on the future global space industry, and has now resulted in the government committing to a federal space agency, essentially for the 21st century. So before we get started, I'd just like to give thanks to TMRO, that's spelled TMRO. So TMRO is a weekly live webcast getting people excited about space exploration. And they'd really love for people to join their conversation in their vibrant community on Saturdays at 6 p.m. UTC time. So if you're excited about humanity's space and science future, which I hope at least some of you are, be sure to subscribe to the channel at one of the buttons just down below on YouTube. I'll give you an introduction into some of these amazing people who formed the expert reference group for Australia's new space industry. I'll start off with Dr. Jason Held, who is the CEO of Saber Astronautics, the space research and development company that combines the latest techniques from human factors, artificial intelligence, and dynamic 3D data visualization to dramatically reduce the cost of space operations. So picture the future of space mission operations software. We've also got Professor Stephen Freeland, who is the Dean of the School of Law and a Professor of International Law at Western Sydney University. He's authored approximately 300 publications on various aspects of international law and is a director of the Paris-based International Institute of Space Law, yes, space law, and a member of the Space Law Committee of the London-based International Law Association. And I'm also very pleased to introduce you to Dr. Megan Clark, who is the former head of the CSIRO here in Australia and was just a couple of weeks ago named head of the Australian Space Agency. She was also the chair of the expert reference group that I've mentioned and has recently set the goal of tripling Australia's space industry by 2030 to 10 to 12 billion Australian dollars. Now, I will take this opportunity to give a little bit of an advertisement to ourselves here at Moonshot. We've just formed a new partnership with a group called StartMate, who are Australia's most successful tech accelerator. And so together, we're looking over the next week, so applications close in 7 days, to bring the most high caliber space startups to Australia as we're building our new industry. We're going to run them through a rigorous 3-month space acceleration program specifically to address the needs of space startups. So you've got 7 days. You can check it out on our website and go for it. So this Q&A session is going to be very interactive. For those of you who are just watching, you may not realize that you can actually ask questions through social media. This is a platform for the members of the expert reference group to talk to the public and for the public to ask them questions. So I will get started with a first question, but please be aware that you can talk on YouTube, on Twitch, on Twitter. We'll be monitoring the feeds just here. So I'm going to start with a question for each of you. We'll start with Jason, and then we'll go through. What does the future space industry look like to you?
As an industry as a whole, I think what we're looking at is we're in the first third of what looks like a 10-year disruption in the small satellite market. Small satellites being CubeSats to microsats. Started with CubeSats. In the next 5 years, you're going to be looking at microsats emerging as kind of the de facto standard that people try and solve problems out in low Earth orbit. I think it's going to be like that for a while. And then 10 years from now, you're looking at a couple of possible things that, whenever you look into the future, you have to put this filter. Is it really going to happen or isn't it? And the further out you go, the less certain you are. But 3D printing on orbit, launch using space planes, those are the two kind of technologies that I think are game changers. The 3D printing on orbit's happening already, but once you could 3D print a satellite, then you've reduced the cost of your mission down from $150,000 to $250,000 like it is now, down to about, I don't know, $10,000, $15,000 per satellite. And that's going to be a fundamental change in the way we do space. And major problems that come from the volume that increases for the amount of spacecraft we have. how do you manage all those assets in space, and then how do you manage the regulatory, and then how do you manage the fact that you've got a lot of different companies enacting together that are trying to both collaborate, in some cases compete in others, in solving these problems. And now we're getting a little bit more sci-fi. What I'm hoping to see are more missions to the moon, more missions to Mars, some of the exciting things that we all want to do, asteroid mining, all those kind of fun things. Not necessarily commercial at this point, but the further out we go and the more use cases we have for the satellites that are in orbit today, the more need we have for some of the resources that are further out in the solar system. So grand picture, space industry, that's kind of how I see it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jason. We'll go next to Professor Freeland.
Okay. Oh, same question. Sorry, I thought you were asking another.
Same question. Yeah.
All of the things that Jason was talking about make perfect sense. I mean, I'm not a scientist or an engineer, so I listen to that in awe. But clearly, if you look at the way that the technology has changed since Sputnik, since the Outer Space Treaty, but even in the last 5 years, clearly, looking at the crystal ball into the future is very difficult. But all of the things that Jason talked about, and probably more, are most likely to happen. And that then gives rise to a whole range of regulatory and legal questions and policy questions and political questions, which are the areas that I'm perhaps a bit more able to speak about rather than the technical side. And you know, these are difficult issues. A lot of people have said that the regulation of space at the international geopolitical level and even at the national level, the regulation of space has stood still while all of these things has happened, and that therefore the law, the regulation, our ability to be able to monitor what's happening is creaking at the edges. And I don't necessarily subscribe to that. I think all of these things that Jason is talking about represents great challenges in terms of how we're going to monitor and regulate. But there are also opportunities. And the fact of the matter is, with all of the technological change that we've had, the regulatory framework has worked reasonably well. We now need to sit down and talk about how we move into the future as we're doing all these things. And clearly at the international level that's happening, although things don't move very quickly. But I'm actually quite optimistic that the law's never going to catch up to the regulation, and nor should it in one sense, because law sometimes can be a bit of an inhibitor. On the other hand, as things move forward, we've all got to keep in mind that there are some bigger questions in mind. The sustainability of space, the environment of space, the fact that space has to be maintained for peaceful purposes and not turned into some war domain, as we've heard in various political areas of late. And so the scientists and the engineers and the technical people and the policy people and the government people and the legal people essentially will all have to sit down in the same room at some point and start to understand more and more this complete complexity and interaction that all of these different disciplines have for space. But I think that will happen because people are realizing and have realized how incredible space is. What a great opportunity this is for Australia through Megan's leadership, for Australia to even propel itself more into this opportunity. But, you know, we have to be a little bit circumspect about where the priorities are. And I think that's the challenge in terms of all these fantastic technologies that Jason talks about. The challenge is trying to work out priorities, not just from the individual entrepreneur's viewpoint, but really from a broader network. You know, what is the best thing for the Australian industry, and where should the energies be devoted, and how do the regulators and the international community look at that and try to work out, well, where is it that we should be devoting our energy and resources? But I think, you know, the landscape will change dramatically, but I think we're ready for it. And I think we'll cope for it, and we're all resilient, and we all recognize the challenges, and let's go. It's a great opportunity. Troy, you're on mute.
I keep doing that. Thank you very much. Megan, now you're in a very unique position because you have the very tough task of, I guess, executing the very beginnings of this modern agency for a future space industry. So what does the future space industry look like to you?
Well, for the first thing, Australia is going to be part of that future, and that's a really positive thing. We have the capacity and capability to step up, and now with this first step of getting a space agency, we can really start to step up and take our place. If we then step back and look at what that future might look like, and as Stephen said, where you might want to focus, we know now that we use space as part of communication networks. We don't really use it much for voice anymore, but where it will really come into the future will be in the data area. And of course, space has the capacity to really lift that bandwidth as we move from radio to radio and optic combination, and perhaps even optics and free laser back down to Earth. That future is already starting to emerge. We just saw a test recently by the German Space Agency with an industry partner where they did a sort of lab to a mountain and did 30 terabits a second. Now that's pretty big, and you can see that space will be part of that. So I see in the communications area space a part of a kind of node, if you like, through all communication networks. We also look at space we forget, just knowing where we are in the GPS network and how much that underpins. So the Australian government recently have put in $260 million to lift Australia from where it was, which was behind the world. We were behind many of the advanced nations in our accuracy. And now that will move to 10 centimetre accuracy across all of our terrestrial areas, all of our maritime jurisdiction, and all of our airspace, and to 3 centimetre accuracy with using the mobile network in the cities, which can underpin then the automation, certainly driverless cars in the cities, and automation throughout the rest of Australia, plus its air and sea jurisdictions. That kind of infrastructure from space is going to really allow us to just go at a whole new level of automation. And as Jason outlined and Stephen also commented, there needs to be responsible citizens in space. We've got over 18,000 pieces of debris in space, and I think that's one area. Australia's a little country, but it's one area where Australia can step up and be a responsible citizen in the future, and we will need that. So both the legal and regulatory framework and players stepping up to help navigate and make space safe and also make it secure. And then there's also, as Jason touched on, there is all sorts of exciting areas such as the new propulsion technologies, both into space and on orbit. We've got if you like, the lowering the definition of space. So now as we look at the low Earth orbit areas and how that's going to completely transform, even improve the latency of communication, down to high altitude platforms, and as we sort of come down and get almost down to commercial airspace. So there are just some extraordinary things that Australia will take its place in the future, and we haven't been doing that in the last few decades.
Great to hear. Okay, so we're getting a lot of great questions rolling in, but I do want to ask you one to all of you, but I'll start with you, Megan, because one of the things that you just mentioned, or there's a few of the things that you just mentioned about what are the benefits of space technology to us here today. One of the difficult parts of that is how do we communicate that to the public and what actually resonates with them. So how is the Australian Space Agency planning to engage with the Australian public? This is from Michael Page from Perth. You use the example, for example, so with SBAS, we're going to have GPS accuracy down to 20 centimeters or 3 centimeters. But what does that really mean? Because there's been articles saying, that means that you'll be able to tell when your Uber's on the other side of the road. But that's not really a great example. So are we going to improve on that? What do you say to that?
Look, it's a great question, and thanks for that coming through. We saw that in the review, that of the really 5 things that the nation wanted the new space agency to do, one of them was inspire the nation with what what Australia can do in space and what difference it can make in Australians' lives. So I think whilst we're absolutely focused on the purpose of growing the Australian space industry and transforming that industry, we know we will be successful if Australians really feel inspired. So that will be such an important part, and we will work really hard to make sure we inspire Australians, tell them what Australia's doing, bring space. And I think you've seen some fantastic initiatives just in the last few months here in terms of engaging the population, and you can see where it's responding. So it's a wonderful motivator, and certainly will help with educating people in what's possible.
Jason, what do you think? Because I've heard you've given some really great analogies in the past, which really help communicate certain topics. Like the one that I love and I use is, for less than the cost of a Boost Juice franchise, you can start your own space program. So what do you think about the communication aspect of all of this?
The communication aspect of what in particular, of the missions we're doing today, or the ones?
Communicating to the public, whether it's in Australia or globally, who don't necessarily see space as this tangible thing. It's still sort of this very out there, right, 400 kilometers away at all times.
Look, space in Australia has a branding challenge that needs to be solved, because space really is ubiquitous to our day-to-day life, and I think people generally understand that. And I think people generally want to have a space program in Australia. I think that the polls showed 70% positive towards what we are doing today and having a space agency. So, for me, sure, I've always kind of promoted the idea of us having our own capability that gives us the flexibility as a nation to do some of these projects ourselves. And that capability includes a manufacturing sector, which I think we still need and still needs to be argued. I think what's happened is there have been, because space is such a aggressively tech, uber geek kind of a field that everybody loves. I mean, what's the holy trinity of STEM is robots, dinosaurs, and space, right? So. We've done some projects that had mass market potential, that people really like to talk about. But there really is an element in Australia where our history has been challenged by people who didn't really have the nation's best interests. Some business deals that did not succeed, and it's a small handful of them, but they had large impact to the decision makers in government, who just to get to the point where we said, hey, a space agency is a good idea, they still think in the back of their minds these old projects. And they still say, well, wait a second, you remember that old thing we tried to do back in like 20 years ago? And man, that was a whole scam. Do we want to go through that again? So on the public side, this is something the public definitely wants to do. On the decision maker side, they've taken a huge, I think, leap of faith in the community, saying, look, all right, we're going to have a space agency. It's going to be a startup space agency, which has certain connotations too, which I think are exciting, interesting, that we could talk about. But we want to handle this very cautiously, and that's why it's a small amount of money now, because they want to see what we as a community to do. So at the end of the day, if we want to change the dialogue, it's up to all of us, working together to do it. Not just us here, but also the people in the audience, making their own businesses and their own research and doing some awesome things, and we really do have to have an all of Australia kind of philosophy as we go forward.
Great, thanks very much. Okay, so we've got a question here from Darcy Longworth. So I'm going to direct this question to you, Stephen. And so Darcy asks, what will the role of the Australian Space Agency be in the near, mid and long term? But particularly, how will the regulatory roles be consolidated? So as I understand, there's like 13 or 14 federal departments, I think, at the moment that sort of look after the space industry as a whole in Australia. How do you see that sort of unraveling and sort of, I guess, being consolidated into a new Australian Space Agency?
That's a great question, Darcy, and obviously I'll defer to Megan with her thoughts as well. But when I had the privilege of working with the government a couple of years ago to begin the process of reviewing the Space Activities Act, which is the regulatory framework around which licensing takes place in Australia, I had to speak to government departments, a whole range of government departments, about how they viewed space. And what became very clear to me at that time was, we think that government has one voice on space, but you realise very quickly that different parts of government view space in different ways. Defence has a particular perspective, and industry has a different perspective, and finance and foreign affairs, etc. And it was interesting having those discussions, and essentially government then subsequently getting together and trying to work out through the agency now the common areas where the agency can work with all of these departments. It's difficult because there are so many complexities and different regulatory frameworks, for example, export control, a whole range of other things. It is a challenge, and it was certainly something that was raised in submissions, both with the review of the legislation and then with Megan's expert review group, that people were saying, well, where do I go? It's all too hard. I think that is a challenge, but I think it's not a challenge that can't be met. Government now recognises, I think, and they've certainly sent off very positive signals to this effect, that law regulation can't be an inhibitor. It must allow, it must be a facilitator, always though in the context of, as Megan said, Australia still has to remain a good global citizen. It has to still encourage responsible behaviour. But I think the idea that we've got 14 disparate departments, or whatever the number is, now thinking about space in different ways, I think that has changed. Previously, as Jason said, all of us go around the country giving talks about space, and they're always packed. People have this thirst, and so the imagination of the Australian population is now being captured by the announcements of the agency and Megan's appointment. But I often give talks about challenges, and one of the big challenges about space was, as Jason said, convincing decision makers that space was really important. I think they are now convinced through the work of so many people and so much expertise that's now apparent in Australia. And I think moving forward, the regulatory side, it's crucial, it's important, but I think people and government will look at it in a way that is there to help, subject to the caveats of responsible behaviour, is there to help and facilitate the broad range of industry that Jason's referred to. It won't be perfect, it never is. There are lots of complexities, but I think it's certainly moving in the right direction. So I'm very positive about the way the government is moving forward on the regulatory side. We all wish it would be quicker, but of course these are difficult decisions. The questions that the government here is asking are the same questions that virtually every country in the world is asking themselves about space. Their solutions and the way they look at it will be different depending upon the goals and risk profiles of each country. But the questions are all the same, and I think the Australian government has asked all the right questions, and hopefully now with the establishment of the agency and other initiatives, we're moving forward in the right way.
Great. So I'll hand over to Megan. What do you think, or what will be the role of the Australian Space Agency in the near, medium and long-term future? And if I can add to that, what do you think your job will look like on July 1, apart from emails, endless emails?
No, it's very exciting. The purpose of the Australian Space Agency is to transform and grow Australia's space industry. And absolutely key to that is the international and national engagement. So the agency needs to open the door so that our industry, from start-up, small, all the way through to the major players, can walk through that door. I've been involved in a lot of things, but I've never been involved where the entire country has asked government to step in. That usually doesn't happen. But it was recognised that this is an area where we need government to open that door. So a very, very clear purpose. And this is at a time when space is moving from being predominantly government funded to being in the commercial realm. And so we're late to this party, there's no question, but it's a good time to come in. And so our purpose will mean that the Australian Space Agency will be one of the most industry and commercially focused agencies in the world. And so we might be small, but it's nice to start with a blank piece of paper. As Stephen alluded to, there will be important roles that the agency will need to undertake. So helping facilitating industry growth. It will absolutely need to open those international doors. It will need to take the role of, for the first time, having an Australian strategy for civil space. We don't have a national strategy for our civil space or national policy for our civil space, and this is so needed as well. And the regulatory piece, of course, important, and that comes in really two forms. So the first form is making sure that we are adhering to regulations, helping form those regulations. We're lucky to have Stephen Freeland in this country, so that we're forming our own regulations, and we're also making sure we're meeting our obligations with our partners in international, and we're helping set those laws globally. The second part is, how on earth do you help a little company that's a startup that's trying to get something out in space and maybe has 5 people and is chasing down funding? How do you help them navigate through all these? So we had literally an example just last week, and I'm not going to name the agency, but someone emailed me and said, I've been asked by a certain government agency that I'm seeking a rebate to explain why I didn't launch my satellite from Australia. Can you write to them and tell them that I can't do that from Australia, I have to do that somewhere else? So these are really simple things, and so I see the agency as having those two hats, which are separate and must remain separate. But we have to help our industry. If we do that, that will be an opportunity for Australia, because others will see that, and hopefully that will attract them to Australia.
Great. So you've hit one of my trigger points. So Conrad Pears of Perth has asked us a question. What kind of support will there be for space startups developing space technologies? And he's used the example of hardware. So I think he's specifically looking at things like satellites and rockets, which traditionally a lot of people have said that Australia will never do that.
Well, first of all, shout out to Conrad, who has been doing some great leadership in the startup area himself. So nice to chat. The agency's role is not to do what industry does well. So startups need to find their commercial application. They absolutely need to find what's their business niche. But what we can do is help the links between research and business. We can help create the links between small businesses and the international supply chains, which will be important. And of course, we can open the door to joint missions, joint projects with our international partners, and that allow some of our smaller companies to be able to test and provide that. That's going to mean that we need to understand what's happening, and we need to understand the startup community and what they're doing. And of course, the sort of work that you're doing, Troy, is a critical link into that community, so that then we can join those two things together and make sure that we're pulling those companies through into the global supply chain. So nice to hear from Conrad.
Great. So, Jason, I'm going to bring you into that question as well. As someone who has, I guess, the experience of seeing both what it's like to do a space startup in the US, having a presence there, having done it here, the hard yards, bootstrapping Saber Astronautics here in Australia. What are the things that you think we really need here in Australia to implement to support our startups? And I guess I'm going to lead into a question sort of after this as well. Some people are saying that $26 million may not necessarily be that much money or enough to do much for the first 4 years. So do we think that we'll be able to implement the support that we need in the near future, or will that be a more long-term thing?
Okay, look, this is a great question, because I've got mixed feelings about it. Okay, on one hand, I love everything that Megan's talking about, the vision for the space agency, and we have to be aware that she is now the CEO of her own startup. And so I'm well appreciative of the fact that she has to go and find customers herself. I mean, it's the wrong term for the potato, but the mindset and what she has to do is, and the discovery process she has to do is very close to the same. So very supportive of the space agency in general. And Megan, feel free to jump in as well. 26 million is not for the general public. Okay, this is for the community, because I've said in a lot of meetings like this, I went through my own kind of come to Jesus moment, about what it means to run a space company anywhere. The idea of a company is not that you succeed because the government puts money in your hat. Okay, the government's job should be to set the conditions so that you can sell. All right, and the job of selling is yours. If you're an entrepreneur, it's not the government's. It should never be the government's. However, there are a couple of things that should happen. On one hand, the government needs to be a customer, and that's something that we need to see being fairly aggressively discussed amongst the community. On the other hand, we as a community, we as entrepreneurs, we as business people, we as researchers need to provide products and services that the government feels comfortable in buying. Okay, so when you're talking about $160 million SFAS project, which is now funded, now the director of that program is going to be asking themselves, who's ready today that I could come to with this money and buy the product off the shelf? Okay, and there's not a lot yet. All right, so if you're saying, oh wow, 26 million, great, now we could fund I don't know, 50 seed-funded companies. You kind of could if you split it up. But it's bullshit, right? You don't want to do that, right? You want a space agency, and you want some funding that does seed and entrepreneurialism and support. But it's got to be you, the entrepreneur, the person. I've always said this for the last 10 years. Don't go to the government with an empty hat and say, please fill it. You know what got this space agency? The fact that there are 80 new startups around the country now that weren't there 2 years ago. That little metric was the deciding factor for a lot of people that said, yeah, we need to tackle this. All right. So all the work that you guys are doing out in the community, this fact that we have a space agency is one of the results of the hard work you're doing. Now, the other side of that coin is how do you sell in a country where we have a habit of not buying and selling from each other? So I'm watching, the startups think that they're competing with each other in order to get a very small amount of money. And I'm watching states trying to compete with each other, thinking that they're going to get this small amount of money. And it's the wrong attitude, because you're not actually competing with each other. You're competing with Americans. You're competing with people who have an accent like mine, right? And they come to Australia and they say the following: don't bother buying from these startups out here. I know they're cute but they're small and they might fail. Why don't you? And they've never flown. So why don't you buy my special product? Why don't you buy my special product? It's flown on 20 missions already. Okay, so you don't bother with your own stuff. Just buy mine. That's what they do, and they own Australia. And that's why companies like yours and mine have had such a hard struggle over the last X number of years to gain revenue, right? And the conditions are changing, but it's got to be us that makes that change happen. On the government side, what I'm hoping to see are launch programs, launch opportunities, some with other foreign governments. Like I could hear Megan talking about that now, but also some others where we're able to kind of get our own kind of launch rides up to get that experience and build that confidence within our own community to do. And that's how I feel about it. Hope that answers the question. I think I might have over-talked. So.
No. There's never over talking. Thank you very much. So we've got a question from Rami in Sydney, who is asking, what thoughts are there towards the role that the new space agency will have for young students and the education program in general? And if I can add a slight twist to that as well, or not a twist, we'll ask that as well. But one of the things that I'm most fascinated by when it comes to communicating what space is all about is aspects like space law, or the fact that you can be into marketing and go into all these different areas that space still needs as a part of the industry. So I might actually start off by directing that to you, Stephen. And have you got any thoughts or advice on any prospective space lawyers out there?
Well, yeah, thank you for that, and thank you for the question. When Jason was talking before about all the Jason and Megan were talking before about all the amazing things that are happening in the technical side, I wanted to butt in and say yes, but space law has also become sexy, and it has, an increasing number. When I first started teaching space law, there were it was not taught, and people would, of course, look at you in rather strange ways when you said you were a space lawyer. That still happens to a certain degree, but I think it's changing. I think because for all the reasons that Megan and Jason have said about the idea that there's this momentum of understanding of consciousness, that space is more and more ever pervasive in our lives, people realize that, okay, this is so important now, we need to have some form of regulation. More and more universities, for example, are teaching space law. Not enough yet, but hopefully that will change. I think the idea of is to look at career opportunities as well. And, historically, in the law, in the policy side, in the regulatory side at least, which is really the areas I can talk about, there's been a perception and probably a reality that there haven't been, if you like, too many opportunities, because there haven't been too many entities or entrepreneurs in Australia that have been engaged and need that sort of assistance and expertise. I think things are changing quite dramatically, and I think the interlinking between policy, regulation, law, and the way things work, and for the reasons I said before, that people need to understand. I'm now teaching space law to engineers, and we're getting engineers to come to our law classes so that people can understand the fundamentals. I think that's the exciting part. Whenever I go and give talks to aerospace engineers, we've got amazing university faculties of aerospace engineers in Australia. You're aware of that as well. Some fantastic people. They are absolutely fascinated by the legal aspects. And then, of course, I learn so much from them about the technical side. And you actually have a really rich conversation. I think that's the opportunity, this recognition that, you can't look at this anymore in silos, because it's real, because we have to help real people like Jason, like you, like all the startups, like the established players in a whole range of ways. And to do that properly, you need to understand a lot of different disciplines. And I think that is the future. So if anyone wants to be, quote unquote, a space lawyer, come and study space law with me, of course, but also look at engineering, understand the science of it. Look at all of the different aspects of how space works. Do a fundamental understanding of physics. And then you'll begin to realize how valuable you can be as you put all that together. Again, I think we need to rethink, and that's something I'm working a lot on, and others are, I know, as well. We need to rethink the way we teach at universities, where you've got disciplines that need to coalesce, and all universities now are talking about multidisciplinary courses. Well, this is an area that is absolutely prime for that. Get all the engineers together with the lawyers and the policy people, and you'll actually come up with really interesting solutions.
Yeah, that's great. I love all of that. One of the ways that I describe space is that it's not really about the rockets and satellites, but it's really that intersection of where science and entrepreneurship and technology come together as humanity is searching for a more abundant future, which adds this highly inspirational aspect to a much broader range of things. So for sure, yeah. Megan, in terms of the space agency, what do you foresee being developed in the area of education and that outreach side of things?
Well, first of all, I think we look to the future, and what we do in space we will do on Earth, and what we do on Earth we will now need to do in space, and that completely opens up the jobs and potential. For 40 years, Australia's been advising NASA on how you operate in harsh remote environments, because we've had bases in Antarctica. We're going to have to figure out how the genetics will change, the epigenetics will change for Mars missions. We're going to have to figure out how we operate. We've already had a food company approach us and say, food in space we need to improve what we do in remote areas. So Australia is a really lovely partner in this because we operate in many remote areas and we have that link. So I think it's extremely broad. And then the education piece, we're already grappling. So even while we're busy doing what we need to do, we've got some little skunk works going on saying, how do we get on the desk of every single student in this country, some augmented reality that allows them to see what we're putting up in space and what's happening. So we're starting to think, how do we get not just to one or two schools, but how do we use our smartphone technology to get to every desk? And we're thinking about those things. We certainly don't have all of the answers. We've got a lot going on at the moment, but it's absolutely in our mind to open those opportunities and allow people to see what's possible. Personally, I have always thought that students are way smarter than the people designing the courses, because they figure out the future intuitively and they make those decisions about where they want to go. So I'm completely confident in the ability of the students to see the future and make the right choices. We do, however, need to make sure that our training structures and the things that are put in place allow that to happen. And all of us are going to have to learn to work alongside a robot, just as the first astronauts needed to figure out how to do that in the International Space Station. So what we do in space, we'll be doing on Earth.
That's great. So I'm going to merge a few different things into one now. So we're just talking about education and the importance of having inspiration, I guess, as a big part of that. So we've got a question from Sasha Balami on YouTube, who said, will the broad commercial and international focus of the agency require two legal teams to advise and facilitate those two distinct legal aspects, so commercial and international? I'm also going to bring in the question from Ashley Hill, who says, what are your thoughts on the Moon Treaty if Australia should withdraw? And then bring in the aspect that, Australia we've got amazing technology to do with mining. And I myself, we've had companies from around the world contacting us for a number of years saying, can you introduce us to someone at BHP or Woodside? Because they've got technology we'd love to license. I'm going to let you guys just jump in. And what do you think about those three things? Might start with Stephen.
Okay, thank you. Well, the Moon Treaty. So for those of you who aren't aware, there are a number of fundamental treaties that were negotiated through a UN process, and one of them is we know lovingly as the Moon Agreement, and that has only got a relatively small number of states that have ratified it. Australia is one of them. There are only 18. And none of, even though we will become a significant space power, but none of the major space powers that you would think of are at the moment parties to that treaty. But that treaty addresses the question, one of the questions that Jason and Megan referred to before, and you also mentioned in your question, this notion of off-Earth mining. That question, that treaty addresses it front and centre. And for a whole lot of geopolitical reasons and ideological reasons going back to the nascent development of former colonies into independent countries, and the fact that there were these notions of the haves and the have-nots in terms of space resources. For a whole lot of reasons, in the late 70s, early 80s, that treaty wasn't very popular. But it addresses front and centre the issues. And rather than, although people will disagree with me, rather than Australia withdrawing from it, I think Australia can, without imposing on other countries the way they want to run it, they can at least point to it as a starting point model. We might, in the end, move well away from it in terms of the way ultimately we regulate this off-Earth mining, but it's an interesting model to at least look at. And Australia, to withdraw from that, I think would be send a negative signal about the way Australia perceives space. I think it can play a role, and at the recent United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space that I had the honour of attending for Australia, this issue came up quite a lot, and the states who were parties to that treaty got together and there were some discussions. In terms of Sasha's question, hi Sasha. Sasha's a former student of space law at my university and now is very, very well respected in the Department of Defence. in terms of Sasha's question about how do you divide do you need two sets of legal entities or regulation? I think not. I mean, I think historically we've talked about international, global, cooperative space ventures. We've talked about civil. We've talked about military space activities. The reality is that they're now coalescing themselves. And it's a bit artificial to try to silo civil activities from from military activities. Of course, the agency will concentrate on the civil side, but as everybody knows, in Australia, but in most countries, the biggest spend on space is by military, is in relation to defend the relative defense departments or whatever. So space is, it's a complex thing. And you now find that the military capability of various countries, because space assets are an important part of security and all of that, the military are now customers of the commercial and the civil. And that's happening in Australia, but that's happening everywhere. And so in the end, the legal framework that we have, it would be artificial to try to divide. Obviously, different people have different responsibilities about the way that those assets are utilised. So I think we need to look in a holistic way in terms of the regulatory framework, rather than trying to divide the way we regulate it. Because in the end, if you divide, you're going to have conflicts in a situation where the activity itself overarches both sides of that. And so, I think we have to see space for what it is. It's complex. Different aspects are looking at using the same assets in different ways. We have what we call now dual use assets, where the same assets are used for civil, for commercial, and for military and security. And we just have to work out the legal frameworks that allow for that to happen while still encouraging responsible behaviour. I'll leave Megan and Jason to talk about these issues and the other aspect that was raised.
Yeah, thanks, Troy. And I think Stephen's certainly discussed some of those areas on the legal side, and I completely agree. It does start to come together. The Moon Treaty, interesting that you raised that. We were literally just talking about that as a team today ahead of the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, because in terms of building base on the moon, how do you do that? And these are critical questions and complex questions. So it's a very complex area, and one that needs deep consideration by the players. So we'll certainly be in those discussions. But the concept and the potential reality of having a platform on the moon from which to then move elsewhere is a very real one that needs to be considered. In terms of the mining, let me look at that from two aspects. As we go out, I was always and consider where our species will be pollinated. What struck me when I looked at the NASA decisions on where the potential landing areas might be for Mars, the most overriding criteria was where water may be able to be mined. And so, the very first question, which is so important to our species, and the thing that links us to Earth is water. The blue planet running through our veins is still the remnants of the salty sea from which we came. Now, this is the thing that absolutely connects us. And as a species, as we go off our planet, of course, we need to find that very thing that connects us to our blue planet. So that, in terms of mining, it will be looking at those essential elements, how we grow our food, how we take resources and combine them for fuel, etc. So it'll be these very basic elements. The good thing is that what we learn of how to do that, I think, will actually help us back on Earth with what is absolutely precious resources, our own water. How do we get fresh water to the western side of India, where the water resources are being challenged by the changes in the climate? So these things that we do on off Earth will, I think, come back. And in the second part, in the reverse, when I look at the mining industry today, how is it engaging with space? It's working to say, gee, I need a rover. I need a little rover to do what I need to do on an area that kind of looks a little bit like Mars already. If you go to some of Northern Australia, how do I do that? How do I use that same technology? I need modular power exactly as we need in space. So the mining industry is looking at modular power. Mining industry is even questions that were coming through to us were saying we need to understand swarm theory, that because we need to manage our remote assets using swarm theory, and swarm theory, of course, coming from the sort of work that's been going in aerospace and drones, etc. So that industry is looking as well to pull in these developments from space, and as areas are automated, the automated train, for example, in the Pilbara, its communication network will be through mobile base stations, but the backup will be space. So these are just examples, again, of as we go off our own planet, and I think we will look back and learn to love our own planet a little more. The things that we will learn, we will bring back to Earth as well.
Great answer. So, Jason, I've got a question that I'll direct to you, and it's from WKD on YouTube. And WKD asks, do you see the importance in developing an Australian-owned launch vehicle, or are there enough private launch service providers around the world and in Australia that money would be better spent on developing other areas?
Okay, great question, by the way, and I've heard it a few times, and it does tie into kind of the question, is this something that the government should spend money on specifically as a national program, or is this a business opportunity that Australian entrepreneurs can dig into? Australia typically has said no to rockets, no to satellites, because they get their hardware and their services from other countries. And now we have an opportunity to change the discussion. The truth is, because of and remember, we're only about a third of the way into the disruption that small satellites is making. So you're seeing a lot of scrambling at this phase of the disruption. So you're seeing a lot of satellites that are launching. You're seeing a lot of mission plans that are being funded. And some of the first satellites out of those mission plans are going up. And what's happened is the launch market for the small satellite sector is right now severely constrained. So the cost of launch has gone up. It's like high school economics. We're looking at an example of high school economics, right? So the cost of your launch went up like that, and it has nothing to do with the tech. It has to do with the fact that everybody wants it now. So the answer is, should we do propulsion? Should we do rockets in Australia? The answer is yes, I think we should. Do we have the money and the kitty to do it as a national program? Not in the way I think we traditionally see it, like a NASA or a Russian space agency kind of thing. But there are some really good commercial programs that have gotten off the ground that have funding, at least to Series A. And what the space agency should be doing, tying in with everything that Megan and Stephen had talked about in the last half hour, is you got a regulatory framework in Australia that needs to be looked at in order to facilitate the Australian technology giving it a go. And in the future, if the funding is available, then sure, do it. But right now, we just need to make it easy for these companies to do it on their own, because the market is definitely there.
I'd like to, I guess, add another element to that, a more international one, Jason. I hope you don't mind. And draw, I guess, a connection to what's happening in the United States, where there's a number of private launch providers. You've got SpaceX, Blue Origin, and those sort of guys, and you've got the SLS program. And there seems to be a lot of, I guess, debate around whether that SLS program should be scrapped because it's taking a lot of money. And you've got SpaceX's BFR and some other sort of very, very heavy lifting rockets sort of in the pipeline that sort of seem to be catching up. What do you think about that, and what is your opinion on that side of things? Awesome
question. Look, I mean, the thing is that we got to ask ourselves philosophically, what is a space agency, right? I mean, a space agency's role is to fulfill the national strategic goal. They're the implementation arm of that nation's strategic goals. So if you see it in that light, knowing that NASA has an SLS program that's not really, that's not as fast as SpaceX or some of these other guys, you realize that one of NASA's major responsibilities is jobs programs for facilities, areas around the country that at the time that it was founded were economically disadvantaged. So the way the United States works is if you try and cut a program, there's a congressperson who sits there who fights the good fight to make sure you can keep the program. And once the money's on the table, it's like taking candy from a baby. There's no way that those, that SLS, I mean, every president that comes on has to deal with it, and it just doesn't get killed. And meanwhile, SpaceX is capturing a significant portion of the market because their tech has dropped the price below, the launch constraint, right? So, right now companies are scrambling. Big space companies are scrambling. Big space satellite companies are scrambling. Major telcos who used to make these large multi-billion-dollar spacecraft are now coming along and saying, what if we did smaller spacecraft and send up swarms of them, all right? And so now I don't know if that exactly answers your question in terms of how do we handle it in Australia. I do think that the argument Megan made saying we got a blank piece of paper gives us a massive, massive advantage as a country to make this look like something that takes advantages of the new landscape internationally, right? So let's not talk about the United States. India, China, Russia, typically the cheaper places to go to for launch. Russia is talking about scaling back on their launch opportunities because, quote, we can't compete with SpaceX, right? Virgin Orbit, once they're up, is going to be potentially a huge benefit to the small satellite market because they're going to be able to go anywhere, launch anywhere cheaply from an airstrip. The technology is affecting the cost. The competition, again, it's led primarily by the United States, but India, of course, is very cost effective. And does that answer your question? Is kind of like the lay of the land?
Yeah, no, it does. Yes, thank you very much. Yeah. So one of the interesting things that's I guess has happened in the last couple of weeks since the announcement has happened is there's been a lot of, I guess, competition within the Australian space community, particularly between states. Sort of, I guess, a lot of people saying we should host the Australian space industry, have the HQ for the Australian Space Agency, and I guess I wrote a little bit of an article about this on the Moonshot blog just last week as well, about how I see, I guess, every state and territory having a very valuable aspect of the ecosystem. So what, I guess I'll direct this to you, Megan. What do you foresee happening in the future with regards to, I guess, a very lean agency? Will it be very centralized in just one area? Or can we expect that it will be accessible to all of the major territories and all of the states?
Yeah, great question, and one that's quite topical. If you go back to the purpose of the agency, which is to transform and grow Australia's space industry, also to engage and do that by engaging internationally and nationally and do national coordination and to aspire Australians, the answer in a way falls out. If you're controlling and making sure we're setting down national policy and strategy, and you do that at the national level, if we're engaging internationally on behalf of the nation, some of those aspects are logically would make sense to do through Canberra and close to government. But if the core of your purpose is to grow the Australian space industry, then you need to be absolutely connected on the ground, which is where the action is going to be in the states and territories where those connections are with industry. So in a way, I think the purpose helps answer that question. So certainly the first job of the agency, and literally in the first few weeks of getting up and running in July, the second and third weeks of July, we'll be going around to all the states and territories to listen and to understand what it is that they think and want to be able to do in their states. And then the government has asked us to come back and put forward an investment proposal that addresses that very question. So great question, and we'll be out there listening, because I think, as we learned from the review, and Jason and Stephen were so much a part of that, is we learned that you must listen to the nation and really listen to those opportunities, and then from that position, then you can come to a logical conclusion around what the right structure is and where we put where we put the activity to absolutely deliver on our purpose.
Great, thank you very much, Megan. Simon Jenner on YouTube asks, insurance is a key restraint for many space projects. How can the agency assist with opening access to those organisations struggling to support this burden? So I'm going to direct this question to Stephen and ask as well, what's happening with the Space Activities Act review? I've heard rumours that it's something's going to be happening this year, but as the chair of that review, what answers do you have for these questions?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And firstly, on the question of insurance, well, insurance obviously plays a vital role in most space activities, but in the requirement to have insurance, or the necessity to have insurance, obviously adds a cost impost. Insurance was an issue when we were conducting the review of the Space Activities Act, the feeling being that some of the financial requirements under that legislation were for the smaller space entrepreneurs and smaller startups that were emerging over recent years in Australia, were adding what they considered to be an unreasonable cost impost on them, and therefore made it very difficult. The space insurance market is not something that Megan or anyone will be able to control, obviously, and it's an open market, and there have been many insurance companies that have started off with a space portfolio and that have closed it down because they've made, incorrect assessments or whatever. So, but it's important that people understand that insurance will always play a part. The way the regulatory framework is set up will perhaps, to a certain degree, determine to what extent it might be required. The second part of your question about the review of the Space Activities Act, let me first correct you. I wasn't the chair of that review. I was asked by the government to assist them, I submitted my analysis report some time ago. The government's been looking at it, and you would have seen in the minister's recent press release, at the same time she talked about Megan's appointment, she did make the point that it's anticipated that the amending act to the Space Activities Act will be coming out this year. So in the report that I put forward, and then with subsequent government discussion, certainly there were a number of options that I put forward and others have put forward in terms of amending the legislation, because the 1998 Space Activities Act was designed for particular reasons, and the landscape has changed to a large degree in Australia, although the Act still works for those that utilise it, for the larger players. But clearly, the legislative framework should be amended, should perhaps be more facilitating for the broad spectrum of actors now that want to utilise Australia for their activities in a much broader way. Hopefully that'll come out soon. The government has put out some issues papers. They've had more consultation even after my report was submitted 18 months ago. So I'm with you, Troy. I mean, I think it will happen soon. The government has indicated it will happen soon. I think they will take a very positive and pragmatic approach. They'll take on board the fact that the legislation is one cog in a broad range of cogs that Megan will have to deal with as she portrays and puts forward the way that the agency is going to encourage industry. But I think the government understands that. So It's a question of watch this space. I have no control over that, obviously, but everybody has said that something will happen sooner rather than later. I don't know, Megan, whether you're in a point where you can comment more on that, but hopefully we'll see something soon, because even though the EIG work was going along and the legislative framework was another process, by and large, they're interrelated, and we've got to get it right at the same time. And I think that's an important part of what the agency needs to see.
Megan, I guess what do you it might be too early to ask, but when it comes to looking, I guess, at the policy side again, one of the things that I was wondering when the Space Activities Act review was happening is, what about the Defence Trade Controls regulations? What about the Radio Communications Act? And how do they interact with each other? It might be too early to, but what do you foresee? Are we going to have more reviews that are similar to like the Space Activities Act one, or how are you thinking you might coordinate? I guess unraveling all of this, yeah.
Yeah, no, you have people like Stephen Freeland at your shoulder when you have to do that sort of unraveling. And I think Stephen's sort of outlined at least what we know will happen in the next steps. And this is a balance of how do you support industry through the licensing process? How do you make sure, as we know, if something goes wrong in space, Australia is responsible? If there's damage, then people will come back to the nation. So you have obligations, and then we have, as you outlined, a whole series of obligations that we have signed up with our partners, both in how we operate on the military side, etc. And so these absolutely need to be balanced, and our obligations and responsibilities are very real. At the same time, we want to facilitate the operation in space. So we certainly will have some good people working in that area.
So we've got a question here from Marty the Martian. So this is an interesting. I'm going to direct this to you, Megan. It's Australia was invited to join the European Space Agency about 30 years ago. Is the offer still open, and will we consider joining?
Yeah, well, it's nice that we are connected to off the planet, so it's great that connection link is working. So great to hear from you, Marty. We will be engaging with space agencies from several nations, and the European Space Agency is all important. Particularly important because the European Space Agency has a ground station in Australia, in West Australia, in New Norcia. And in our discussions with the European Space Agency, a very important part of their deep space communication network, just as Tidbinbilla is one of the 3 deep space communication networks for NASA. So too early to outline how that will go. We need to engage and work through what are the possibilities and what are the options, but it will be part of our discussions internationally.
Do we think that I'll sort of let anybody jump on this one? Do we think that Australia might be able to be a leader when it comes to if we're going to become this international participant? We've got a clean slate to start on and to unwind all of our policy that we've just been talking about. We've seen countries like Luxembourg and the United States really go, I guess, really ahead of the curve with new acts and changes to regulations around things like commercial space activities in space and space mining. Do we think that Australia will remain conservative, or will we be a progressive leader when it comes to, I guess, jumping into this head first, into this new global space industry? Jason, I might ask you.
Well, look, it's really up to us. I'm confused as to why Luxembourg did it, but I think it's awesome that they did it, right? And again, these are the United States and Luxembourg. It's like comparing apples and oranges, right? The U.S. Space Agency with their goals totally different from Luxembourg and theirs. I certainly couldn't speak to the regulatory framework like Stephen can. All I can really say is if Australia wants to do something like that, picking one specific aspect of a huge space problem and say go for that specifically, then then we'll do it. I think the decision to make Australia and the goal of building commercial industry, building an industry that could handle our national needs. I think we as a community, if we want to do anything exotic like mining on the moon and moon missions and asteroid missions, we need to look at the business case and make a case for that has commercial legs, and that is the kind of thing that I think the government will be supporting later. That's my opinion.
If Troy, if I could just add to that, certainly what I've seen, and I'm sure Megan and Jason can talk to this as well, Australia is well regarded already in this whole international community, notwithstanding that we haven't had an agency until now. But we are seen as a country that has taken the lead in a number of areas, like the sustainability issues. You know, we were involved in working groups in the UN on that, and people do look at us. And I think the establishment of the agency will make that an even greater regular thing. So I think Australia has a really important role to play. It does it already, but I think it can play it in a greater way as a responsible nation that is at the forefront of coming up with solutions that really will work as this technology develops. And that's part of the engagement that the agency and other people, but particularly the agency, will look to, because people do turn to Australia. When you go to meetings in this forum, and I'm sure in others, but if you go to meetings in space, people do ask what the Australian view on certain things is. And, you know, to a certain degree, we haven't had strong views in the past on some issues, we have on others. But I think now that Megan's at the helm, we will identify even more those areas where Australia can take a lead. And we are a highly respected country in this domain, notwithstanding the fact that perhaps we're not a major space power as yet, but people will look at us.
I like your choice of words, "as yet," in there. Megan, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that's Stephen sums it up very well.
Great. So I've got a question from Henry Sitt. How will the agency procure the necessary capabilities, talent, and resources to function properly? So I think that's an interesting question on the back of the one about, you know, will we join the European Space Agency? And I guess more broadly, what will our international relationships look like, as well as just the, I guess, the internal capability building?
Yeah, great question. And in terms of where we're looking to get in the next 12 months, we kick off in July, and we will be looking to bring in the talent that we need at that early stage. It'll be just around 20 roles that we'll be looking at, and that will be international and national, seeking that capability. We also see that there's, in a sustainable model for the agency moving forward, it would be fantastic to be able to create an opportunity where we can have people moving through the agency in some sort of mechanism, you know, internships, etc., so that we can assist and be connected to many more careers as well. And then I think highlighting, of course, where those roles will be as the industry is growing, as we've got companies that are growing. You know, I was talking just a few weeks ago to Woodside, who had 40 people in their robotics lab, where they were looking at sort of rovers and, as I said, working with NASA, and they said they were to quadruple that, and that's that's 100, you know, that's going to be 160 people working in that area. So making sure that you know, the agency isn't going to be able to, you know, hire everyone in the way that a big agency would. But what it can do is point to where those growth areas are, and I think there'll be, if we do our job right, there will be growth opportunities throughout the country.
Fantastic. All right. Well, we've gone a little bit over time, but I might call it right there. But thank you so much, everybody, for joining this discussion and sharing your thoughts on this. Is there anything? I mean, you guys all put a lot of work in over the last year, and I guess, you know, we'll continue to do so in your various domains. Is there any last things you would like to shout out there to the public and communicate? Yeah.
Look, from my end, I would just wanted to thank all of the people that over many years have worked very hard for this, and also all of the people that came out with a single spirit, which was to assist us to provide the right advice to government, and the unbelievable talent we had in the expert review group, and at all of the meetings we had was overwhelming. So just a big thank you to the nation for helping us get to this point.
Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Stephen, how about you?
Oh, look, I can only echo, what Megan has said. There are so many people who have an interest in space, both in the industry and now in the broader community. And there's so much positive energy and so much expertise in our engineering, in our science, in our universities, in our research, in our regulatory areas. I think it's an incredibly positive, optimistic future for Australia in this. And what we need to do is get everybody to move forward in that way. We need a lot of people to cooperate, because in the end, cooperating on some of these ventures is actually going, 2 and 2 will equal 5 or 6, not two separate things. And I think, given the complexities that everybody has talked about with some of the activities and the possibilities for Australia, the future is very positive. But you can't be complacent, because every country wants to do this. The global space economy is growing at almost 10% a year. And that's 3 times or 4 times what the global economy as a whole is growing. And so everybody wants a piece of that pie. But I think we have great opportunities. And again, with Megan's leadership and the way that the agency can, if you like, bring all of that expertise, help to bring that expertise even more to the forefront, I think it's a really positive future. And I think we really have to get behind those sorts of efforts. Not everything will work out perfectly, of course. We all understand that. But, as Jason said, this is in a sense, a startup phase. But I think it's a startup phase that has a fantastic future. So thank you again for allowing us to talk about that.
No worries. Jason, do you have anything?
Process of elimination. You saved the guy with the face for radio to be the last one.
Last but not least. You're the godfather of the Australian new space community. So
I'm not old enough to be a godfather yet. Look. All right. Look. Bottom line up front. The expression that comes to mind is, "You may be whatever you resolve to be." Okay. And I'm very grateful for the chance to I see this as community service. Being a part of the ERG was a great experience. But at the end of the day, what I say to the community again is, you could be whatever you resolve to be. If you want to do rockets, if you want to do satellites, if you want to do downstream applications, it's up to us to kind of continue the momentum we've had over the last 2 years, continue to grow. Remember that what we have right now is not the end. It's not like, okay, this is a space agency. This is, in fact, the beginning. And that beginning is entirely up to us as a group, as a community, not just the government, but us as the people, the stakeholders to work. But the good news is now there's the start, the seed of a framework that we could plug into that can, and it has a vested interest in protecting us. And this is something we absolutely can do together. And that's what I want to see happen over the next few years.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone. So before we do go, I'd just like to give a special thanks to TMRO for lending us this amazing virtual room. It's very spacious in here, so thank you very much. It's fantastic. Also, thank you very much to our partners at StartMate for working with us and helping us run the very first space tech accelerator here in Australia. So if this sounds interesting to you and you're a founder of an international space company, you've got 7 days to put in an application, and we'd love to hear from you and have a chat about what this might mean to you. And if you're an international person watching this at the moment, or even within Australia, and you're interested to build your own space startup, like Jason said, you can build your own space program for less than the cost of a small business. Now, we will also be running our Gemini program across 4 continents later this year, where we can help you get into the space industry. So thank you very much to everyone who asked questions and to those that are watching. And stay tuned. We'll be back for a similar session in the future. Thank you very much and good night.